Welcome to 10th or Tuesday. This is episode number 37. My name is Michael Boldin, joined by my good friend,
Michael Maharrey. And what people don't know, this is actually 37.3.
Right. So today is day 516 that the GOP has failed to get rid of Obamacare, Common Core, Patriot Act, mass surveillance, so much more. Things are not looking good. So many people have relied on the federal government to limit the power of the federal government. We know through warnings all through history that when you count on government to control itself, that government is always going to grow. And today we want to focus a little bit on mass warrantless surveillance, whether it's NSA, FBI, DEA, whatever it may be. And Mike, you were mentioning to me before we started recording that this makes you think of the Frank Church hearings back in the 1970s. And I think a lot of people don't really know what that was and what the warning was and how great. I mean, you run with this.
Yeah. So back in the 70s, Senator Frank Church held a series of hearings on surveillance and basically government spying. And at that time, he said that the surveillance state as it existed in the mid-1970s gave the government the potential for total tyranny. And those are the exact words he used. And think about that. This is in the mid-70s. So this is before everybody's on the internet. This is before everybody's carrying around their own personal location device in their cell phone. It's before everybody had, emails going back and forth. Even at that point, Frank Church was talking about the potential for total tyranny. So if that was true in 1975 or 76 or 1977, where are we now? What potential does the government have? And yet, despite these warnings, Congress did absolutely nothing to rein in the surveillance state. In fact, they've made it worse. They've broadened it. They passed the Patriot Act. They passed FISA. We've had executive orders that have expanded spying. So the federal government's done nothing to heed this warning. They knew in 1975 that this was a potential problem, done nothing about it. Here we are today in 2018, and that potential is even greater. And as you mentioned, we're fortunate that that the government has not decided to go to that complete route.
Yeah, I think the argument is, hey, you guys are talking about it, so it can't be that bad. Well, the danger of power is not only the danger that it's being used right now. When you're smart thinking, you recognize what bad things could happen. And when you only think in the moment, a lot of times you're not prepping for the future. People who only think in the moment never think about their retirement, run into problems later on. People who only think, like, I like this federal program, I don't care what they do to make it happen, what they spend, I like the end result today. Well, in the future, someone's going to use that power against you or your family or somebody else. So the problem that we face is centralized power. And right. Surveillance is getting worse and worse and worse every single year, whether they're tracking our phones, they're monitoring our locations, they're watching our 10th or Tuesday episodes, whatever it may be. It's not good. It gives them a lot of power. I've seen a lot of memes on the internet, I think, that are true. Stalin would have loved to have this kind of surveillance network.
Can you imagine?
He wouldn't have needed a spy on every corner because we all have them in our pockets. So relying on the feds to stop this is foolish. But we've been working very hard for a number of years to take on the crown jewel of the surveillance state, undermine these federal spying programs at a state and local level. And just on Sunday of this week, just 2 days ago, the Michigan, the kind of the leading piece of this against the NSA went into effect in Michigan, a very positive first step. The Fourth Amendment Protection Act. Mike, give an overview of that bill, because you really, over the last few years, you've really kind of taken the lead on working with legislators and activists on this particular piece of legislation. And I think, kudos to you on all the work that you've been doing on this. But give an overview.
I'll be honest, this is probably the most excited I've been about a bill passing, mainly because I did put so much work into it and was intimately involved in the legislative process as it worked its way through the Michigan legislature. Basically what the new law does is it prohibits the state of Michigan from participating in or assisting the federal government in warrantless surveillance. The way it's worded is it prohibits the giving any assistance to gathering warrantless data. And there's some exceptions that allows the federal government and the state to exchange information that is voluntarily given, but it slams the door on the state participating with or using warrantless information that is gathered without a person's consent. And so this is a huge step forward. It puts a wall between the federal surveillance state and the state of Michigan. And I think, in effect, it will definitely cause some of this information sharing to cease if the law is followed.
And that's positive. I would say even if it stopped a couple of percent, and I think it's going to be more than that. Only time is going to tell. But I think it's very clear that no one is complaining about my home country of California being an immigration sanctuary state because not participating in federal immigration enforcement isn't working.
Right.
Maybe that sounds convoluted. There is no one out there that is saying we need to stop California because we don't like what they're saying. They're saying we need to stop California because they're helping undermine federal immigration enforcement. And they're doing that primarily, the vast majority of what they're doing here in this state is by not participating in immigration enforcement. And the same can be applied on basically just about everything. Right. And applying it to surveillance in Michigan is a big step. We've been working on this for a few years, and it's good to see Michigan is actually the first state to pass what would be kind of from our model legislation to undermine the NSA itself in full. California passed a first step towards it a couple of years ago. And we know that even though they passed the USA Freedom Act a couple of years ago under Obama, a lot of people said, oh, that's going to end it. No, it didn't happen. And then when Trump came in, a lot of people told us, you don't have to worry about this. The new Trump administration, they're going to stop it. Well, he pushed for more. Right. And the Republicans in Congress love more spying. The FISA Reauthorization Act gave another 6 years, right, to mass warrantless surveillance.
Right, and a lot of the real nuts and bolts privacy and surveillance experts that I've read said that there are provisions in the new FISA reauthorization that actually expand the ability of the federal government to spy on Americans using supposedly foreign intelligence authorization. So they've actually made it worse.
I think the end result, and just to kind of reiterate what we've been saying since the beginning of this episode here, Mike, is that all these lawsuits and federal legislation efforts over the last few years, and then we can go all the way back to the 70s, have done nothing. It's only gotten worse. It will continue to get worse. I gave this in a presentation with the ACLU and the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition at a small event here from Restore the Fourth here in Southern California a few years ago. And of course, some technology writer said, oh, what are these great people and the neo-Confederate talking about? They didn't like it. And I said, hey, you guys may not like what I have to say, but at some point, when you realize that all of these federal efforts fail, you're going to have to come to this strategy to resist, refuse, and nullify these mass surveillance programs on a state and local level. And then you can even get into, well, maybe we should do a show on it eventually, an individual level, how you can protect your privacy without government helping you at all. But this is very positive. Michigan Fourth Amendment Protection Act, you worked on this really, I guess, for about 3 years, because the bill was filed last session, the 2015 to 2016, and didn't go anywhere. And then it was refiled here in 2017 and took 2017 through 2018 to finally get passed, and it went into effect just a couple of days ago. So again, give us a couple of points. It bans what's called material support or resources from the state of Michigan to the federal government, right? That's the general rule.
Right. So in effect, the state of Michigan, its personnel, its agents, cannot assist in the gathering of warrantless surveillance. So let's give for example, let's say that there's a task force run by the FBI, and they're going to do some type of warrantless surveillance that's authorized under some federal authorization that's out there. The state and local police are now not legally allowed to participate in that. Furthermore, any data that's gathered in this way, and it's passed on to the state and local law enforcement, is not admissible in state and local courts. So this warrantless data that's being gathered up by NSA or other federal agencies that's being passed through all of these fusion centers and other information sharing systems that are being developed, those cannot be used in a state or local criminal case, or nor can they be used to as a basis for a warrant. So they can't say, oh, well, we know this is going on because of this surveillance, so we're going to get a warrant. They can't do that either. So it really restricts the use of this warrantless information. So that's really the practical effect in terms of actual data. I think another important thing to realize is that it would prohibit any cooperation with the state of Michigan if the NSA were to decide to put a facility in the state of Michigan. And we know that the NSA is aggressively expanding its facilities as they've run out of electric grid in Maryland. They've expanded into Utah, into Texas, into other states.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't even realize what's going on in that. And we're going to cover that a little bit more in just a couple of minutes, Mike. But that is an important part of the bill. It basically prevents the NSA from being able to set up shop in Michigan. Because even if they were to set it up on federal property, if there is such a thing in Michigan, if they were to try to do that, they would need to get the electricity or the water resources to run that facility. And those services are almost always provided by a political subdivision, a government-run subdivision of the state of Michigan or the state of wherever the NSA locates. And if they aren't able to secure those contracts, they won't be able to build the facility. And what we've generally found out in the past, when they expand, no one knows these facilities are going to come online until all the contracts have already been signed, all the deals on all the electricity, all the water has already been done. It's always done behind closed doors. So if it's against the law for the state to do that, it is very likely, not that governments follow laws, but in this type of a situation, it is very likely that the NSA will just look elsewhere. And while that's kind of kicking the can, let's get into that in a minute. So people...
Hey, let me give you an analogy just real quick, to kind of give people an idea of how this works. Imagine if you put a sign on your door that says, don't knock on my door, no soliciting. Now, somebody might knock on your door, but more than likely they're going to go to your neighbor who doesn't have the welcome mat pulled up. So it's kind of like taking away the welcome mat, and it's a disincentive. Governments, like anybody else, they follow the path of least resistance. They're much more likely to go someplace where they know they're going to get full cooperation than to go to a place like Michigan now where they're not going to get any cooperation whatsoever.
Yeah, maybe they'll go to Missouri. Well, I think another example on this, you made me think, it's kind of like gun control. Criminals are going to the places where there are no guns. Well, if they know there might be guns, even if they're not in every home in a neighborhood, it's unlikely they'll go there. They're going to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why gun control is so bad. But, so, did you get a lot of opposition when you were working on this? I know that you had worked directly with Martin Horlak, the sponsor, quite directly through maybe one of his team members or something. Did you get a lot of pushback on this?
Yeah, there was a lot of pushback initially. So it was about a year ago, about this time last year, there were a series of meetings between Horlak's office and some of the other supporters of the bill, and then your law enforcement lobby, sheriffs, police, those folks. And, they were obviously against it, but I have to give the sponsor and other supporters there in Michigan credit. They did a really good job of addressing those issues up front and solving some of the problems that they knew were going to come up, so that they basically put the police lobby in a position where if they had aggressively opposed it,
they would have looked bad.
They would have looked like they were nitpicking because they addressed the initial issue. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so excellent.
It was kind of a preemptive type of thing where they couldn't publicly oppose it because the sponsor could have just said, look, we've already addressed these issues that they brought to us, and this is what they said was fine. And so then once it actually started getting public traction, there really wasn't a whole lot that the opposition could do.
Then that's how a lot of this plays out. A lot of organizations, whether they're police lobby groups, gun lobby groups, whatever it may be, they want to have a particular public image. So we ran in, total aside, A few years ago, through maybe 2013, 14, and 15, there was a very, very strong movement in Missouri, led by our friend Ron Calzone at Missouri First, mofirst.org, to nullify all federal gun control. Well, the lead opposition to this, it basically almost made it to the governor, who would have vetoed it, but they would have. At one point, it passed both chambers, but in slightly different versions. They ran out the clock. But there was a very legitimate, strong effort to do this. The top opposition that we faced was the NRA. The NRA never were publicly opposed to it, but they were working behind the scenes to undermine it, making handshakes and things like this, to the point that the lead sponsor the first round, Senator Brian Nieves, who's kind of a bomb thrower when it comes to his speeches, he ripped up his NRA card on the Missouri Senate floor. So not to get into that whole discussion too much, but this is the types of thing happens from people that we would normally oppose or people that maybe we would support all the time. There's all these kinds of pressures, but if you can figure out what they're going to be saying in advance, which we know when it comes to things like this, you can put them into a corner, and I guess you guys did a great job of that in Michigan. Everybody working on that in Michigan did a great job. I know that Dennis Marburger and Shane Trejo testified in committee. We're going to put up some video about that over the summer. And when you know the arguments in advance, it's a lot easier. They don't have a lot of legitimate arguments. Now, one of them that they make, though, is that you can't do this. Right. Oh, the supremacy clause says you can't just opt. Because what they're doing is they're basically saying we're opting out of helping. And they'll tell us you can't do this. But we know, and you reported on this for years too, Mike, that this is it's rare. We don't like looking to the Supreme Court for validation, but when it comes to going through the legal process in a state, having the Supreme Court back you up makes it a lot easier, and the anti-commandeering doctrine is something that the Supreme Court has been behind us on, and that's what this is based on. The overview, Mike.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because in one of the very first conference calls I was on, when they were trying to build support for the bill, get it ready to be introduced into the committee in the fall, that was one of the first issues that came up. One of the opponents said, well, I'm not sure we can do this. And luckily I had the talking points right there in the tippy top of my head and was able to totally destroy this idea that the supremacy clause prohibits a state from, refusing support. And it doesn't. It's a very well-established legal doctrine known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. It's based on now 5 key Supreme Court cases that actually date all the way back to 1842 in Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which interestingly was a fugitive slave case. And in that case, Joseph Story basically said that the federal government could engage in fugitive slave rendition. They could send slaves back to their owners, but they could not require the states to take that action because it was, in effect, a federal responsibility. And so Story said that the federal government has to do its own work and achieve its own federal policies. And the states, they can help if they want to, but they cannot be required to pursue a federal goal or implement a federal program or enforce a federal law. And this is reinforced.
Over and over and over, all the way back to 1842. And then the most recent ones the famous one is the Prince case, where they wanted to have local sheriffs enforce the Brady Gun Control Act or take part in that. And Sheriff Mack and Sheriff Prince sued and won, again, the anti-commandeering doctrine. And the most recent one was just last month, Murphy versus NCAA, where the feds were trying to tell state legislators that they couldn't, in New Jersey, they couldn't legalize sports betting because the feds said it's illegal. And again, and I think part of I would have thought that this would have been a close decision, like 5-4, but it was 7-2, because I think the liberal justices now love the 10th Amendment because they hate Trump, but that's fine. If they're going to reinforce it for political nonsense, that just makes it harder for them to go against it in the future.
Yeah, and it was really interesting in that Murphy case. Alito, I believe, wrote the majority opinion on that, and he put it so emphatically. Basically, he said that Congress cannot direct state legislatures and tell them what to do.
Period.
period. And he called it a fundamental part of the constitutional structure. And so I think that the anti-commandeering doctrine, it's cemented in jurisprudence, as the fancy legal word goes. And I think it's constitutionally consistent. And like you said, not really big fan of the Supreme Court.
No.
Don't usually worry about what as my friend Brian Balcom likes to call them, the federal temple monkeys. Not really that concerned with what they have to say. But in the legal environment that we live in, the world that we live in, especially when you get into a Senate hearing or a state legislature, a lot of these guys are lawyers, especially on these important committees like the Judicial Committee. So it's very important that we can point to something that shows within the legal system that this is valid. It takes away that argument and it forces them to address the issue at hand. So we don't have to argue about whether or not we can do it. Instead, we get to argue about whether or not
the policy itself.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a much more difficult argument for the statists to win than it is to just say, well, it's illegal.
And as we saw, they got their asses handed to them in Michigan, where the vote was 108-1 in the House and 37-0 in the Senate. And there are a lot of opponents of liberty in both the House and Senate in Michigan, and the governor is bad too, but there's just was so much public support to take this type of action. Now, they're basically putting this anti-commandeering doctrine into practice, and the anti-commandeering doctrine itself is just reaffirming what James Madison specifically advised in Federalist 46, where he said if you want to stop federal programs, constitutional or not, what you do is you use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. James Madison's words, not mine, not yours, Mike. I mean, now we use them, but we're just copying Madison. And if Madison said it, this is what you do to do it, I think he knew what he was talking about. So the Supreme Court actually has done the right thing on this one particular issue over and over and over and over. And Michigan put this into practice, banning the use of material support or resources to a federal agency. I'm reading from House Bill 4430. It prohibits a state and its political subdivisions from assisting, participating with, or providing material support or resources to a federal agency to enable it to collect or facilitate in the collection or use of the data, blah, blah, blah. And what is material support or resources? Well, when we started looking into this after the Snowden revelations a few years ago, I started finding all kinds of memorandums of agreement between the NSA and local governments to say, they would provide water or electricity, whatever it may be, because the facility needs that. Right. And that reminded me, I'm a former leftist, and I spent a lot of time in the anti-war movement. I mean, I'm still part of that movement in a way, but unfortunately that movement primarily went, I think it has always been, instead of being anti-war, just pro-socialism. And they're saying, hey, let's substitute war spending for domestic spending. And that's not what, I'm not into that. So I stopped participating in that. But I remembered from my time in that realm the language of the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act was so broad, they used a legal phrase called material support or resources. And in the legal world, this is a phrase that's so broad that can mean basically anything. You can accidentally provide material support or resources. You can provide trash collection, snow removal, water, any type of thing that helps effectuate terrorism. Well, in the Fourth Amendment Protection Act model legislation that we put together a few years ago, and now Michigan has passed into law, they use that same term. So Michigan is very broadly prevented from providing any support or resources to mass warrantless surveillance. And that includes participating in the information sharing environment, Mike, right? This is this part, I think it came out of the Patriot Act as well, where they're requiring everyone to share data across, no matter how they get it. No matter how they share it. It goes through fusion centers, for example. So if you collect information in one state, every state has it. The feds have it, and vice versa. And then, of course, parallel construction. I think this is an extremely dangerous one, and you touched on it a little bit about the feds collecting data and then passing along for local prosecution, but they do it in a pretty nefarious way as well in parallel construction. You want to give you're better at that than I am explaining this one.
So Bill Binney was a former NSA technical analyst, like a technical chief.
He was the technical director.
Technical director. So he was high up. And he called this parallel construction how do you put it, the most dangerous, I wish I could remember it, something about the most dangerous.
Greatest threat to the Republic, I think.
Since the Civil War. That's exactly what he said. Yeah, the gravest threat since the Civil War. And so what is this parallel construction? So basically what they'll do is the NSA is spying on everybody. Even though they're not supposed to be spying on Americans, they are. And they use all kinds of loopholes and legal justifications to do it. And let's say they run across information that Michael Boldin is selling cocaine. So they'll take that, and I'm neither confirming nor denying that Michael Boldin is selling cocaine, just to be clear. But let's say that they had this information. They would pass that on to the Los Angeles Police Department. The Los Angeles Police Department would take that information, but they wouldn't use it directly. Instead, they would get a warrant and build a case on their own evidence that was basically inspired by the evidence that they were given illegally from the federal government. So they could create a case that can hide where the information actually came from and get away with using warrantless information that is not legally gathered, and build a case on that. And so basically they're lying about where they're getting the information from,
right.
And they're creating a brand new case. Obviously, this goes against the most basic fundamental right to a free trial, right to know where your evidence is coming from. It violates the Fifth Amendment. Obviously, it violates the Fourth Amendment. And this is happening on a regular basis. We know it's happening. And that's one of the important aspects of the language that's used in these Fourth Amendment Protection Acts. It actually prohibits the use of this type of information. It makes it illegal. It provides a legal remedy if anybody finds out that this is going on, and good defense attorneys have ways of finding these things out, then they can get the evidence thrown out. So extremely invasive, just absolutely a horrible practice that's being used on a regular basis to solve everyday crimes using illegally gathered data, and not necessarily solving crimes. I mean, just because they have some data that points to some evidence doesn't mean it's actual
right.
Legitimate evidence.
Now, this is now part of the Fourth Amendment Protection Act in effect in Michigan. It's also partly effect. They passed just this narrow part of it in Utah a couple of years ago. Maybe a couple of other states. Vermont also did that. So this is really important. The practical effect, like they talk about, okay, they're building, people are frightened that they're building profiles on people to be used at some point. Well, they're using it. And they're using it in this very creative, illegal way, and taking action against it on a state level actually ends the practical effect of how it's being used in many situations. So that's very positive. Now, we talked also about locations. They're pulling out the welcome mat in Michigan. Well, what's the point of doing that? Well, the whole point is now that one state has done it, 1.5 if we count California. Hopefully we'll get it to 2 and get that follow-up here. But once one state does it, we also heard from a state rep in Missouri who was inspired by this and decided to file legislation, which he got passed through one house. I think it was 106 to 1 or some really high number that he got passed through the Missouri House. The Senate is filled with a bunch of bad guys there, so they always just avoid having hearings. But it does inspire other legislators to take the same action. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the locations where the NSA has built. So Fort Meade, Maryland, you mentioned they were running out of power, right? This is back in 2006. The reason that they actually started building the locations, the famous one in Utah, is because they maxed out the Baltimore area power grid, and they were concerned. It was in the Maryland papers that they were concerned that it would shut down the agency. They'd blow out the entire power grid for the city. Right. So they had to go out and find new locations. So there's physical limitations on how much data they can collect, and if that's not mind-boggling enough, so they expanded to Bluffdale, Utah. San Antonio, Texas may even be bigger than the Utah location. They've also had facilities in Yakima, Washington. That's the old one. Augusta, Georgia. Aurora, near Colorado Springs, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There's one in West Virginia, Oahu, Hawaii. So this type of legislation is really important because I can be certain, and I'm sure you can too, Mike, that behind the scenes they're looking at other states, Montana, Wyoming, California, where else. And the more states that take this action and pull the welcome mat out, the more difficult it is for them to expand. Let's box them in and then take the next step from there. That's my mentality on it, at least.
Yeah, and I like that analogy. You box them in. The more states that pull up that proverbial welcome mat, the less options that the NSA has. And then we can take it to the next step, and we can go to a state like Utah and pass a similar bill there and actually turn off the water or turn off the electricity that's being supplied by the city of San Antonio in Texas. And really put a crimp in
it's
what
interesting.
The NSA is doing.
California, immigration sanctuary state that people really hate. I call it my country because it really is in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the way the founders, they were Virginians first.
Absolutely.
So I think we should take pride in that, even if we're not always proud of. No one should be really proud of what their state or local governments are doing in most situations. But let's take pride in our homes. That's what I try to do, even though I love where I live, even though there's problems. But anyways, that's a side note. So California is actually, I don't know if it's passed into law. I need to look at my notes on this again. They're ending contracts with running detention facilities for ICE. So they're saying no new ones. And then when the current ones run out, the state is no longer going to do this because the facilities are generally run by the state. So the same thing could be applied. And Jeff Sessions, I think this is included in his lawsuit. He's not going to win on this. I guarantee it. It's not going to win, especially after the 7-2 ruling in Murphy v. NCAA. Whether he should win or not, we could have that discussion. It's not going to happen. Right. California's going to win on this, hands down.
Well, and it's just like, this reminds me, I have to bring this up, Yucca Mountain in Nevada. The state of Nevada effectively stopped the locating of a nuclear waste dump on Yucca Mountain, a very unstable geological area near Las Vegas.
By turning off water.
By turning off the water.
So it works.
The federal government wanted water so they could start drilling, and the federal government refused to give the state government in Nevada refused to give them the permits.
Yes.
And there was no water. They couldn't drill. And the federal government, of course, they went to court, tried to sue to make Nevada give them the water.
They lost.
And the federal court lost. Yeah, the federal court said, no, it's Nevada's water. They can use it as they see fit. And they don't see fit to use it to put a nuclear waste dump on a, earthquake-prone mountain. So
the same process should happen in these other states.
Absolutely.
And Utah, we ran into some problems because the local government is so tied in. They've built all kinds of stuff with federal dollars. This is what they do. And it was so tied in to the federal facility, and they didn't want to break the contract. I think legally and morally, they should break the contract and say, bring it on. We're not going to find too many politicians willing to do that, but you could take the California approach and say, well, this is a directive to all subdivisions to not renew any current contracts. They could do that in Utah. And I think that would be a very positive step. We're going to end this relationship with the NSA in Utah or in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or wherever they may be. The state of Texas is providing electricity through its independent electrical grid to the massive NSA facility in an old Sony warehouse in San Antonio, which they built because it was just a mile or two down the line from a Microsoft data center.
Right.
So they can tap right into it. So this is a very positive step forward that can be taken. Michigan got the ball rolling. Now it's time for other people in other states to follow up, and then we'll box them in and bring them down.
Yep, and I can assure you that we will be working over the summer, contacting legislators in other states, letting them know that this happened, and encouraging them to introduce similar legislation. And hopefully we'll see a rash of these bills. And, it's like a bad marriage. You're in a bad marriage, you get out.
Will you?
We're in a bad marriage with
now that you mention that, will you task yourself to look through everybody who's filed some kind of bill like this or any of the pro-privacy ones, and let's just put together a list of all the legislators that we know, and then we'll figure out a plan to reach out to them maybe sometime in August.
I'll do it.
Awesome. So one other thing, Mike, you and I, we're going to New Orleans.
We are.
Next week, in 10 days. We'll be there from the 29th through 29th of June.
Yeah,
and
July.
then leaving on Monday, July 2nd. We are, I'm speaking, and Mike, you're going to be there as well. We're going to be talking to a bunch of people at the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus Take Human Action event, Take Human Action Bash. A lot of really great people are going to be there, like Scott Horton, Tom Woods, a bunch of cryptocurrency people. The idea is, and some of them are going to take different positions than we do, but it's nice that we have a presence there. Our message is going to be decentralized for liberty. The federal government shouldn't be doing as much as it does, not even close, and we're all going to be much happier and much more free if we make these decisions closer to home. So what's the website? Do you know? I think it's Take Human Action. Take Human Action Bash. Just Google that if you want to meet us there. It's free tickets. Come on out. We'll be there for a couple of days. I think Sunday is mostly going to be Mike and I catching up and eating. So
I think there's going to be a lot of eating.
There's going to be some eating. I've never been to New Orleans, but I'm excited for the event. Dave Smith will be there. Marie Sabrin.
Robert Murphy's going to be there.
Bob Murphy will be there. So a lot of great thinkers and leaders in this whole movement. And we'd love to see you there. That's the Take Human Action Bash. Of course, before we get going, I do want to mention that our 12-year anniversary is here at the end of the month as well.
Right.
So we definitely need some more support, but we're trucking along 12 years now. If you want to get on board with us and you haven't already, go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And you can sign up for as little as $2 a month. It really makes a difference. And we are getting stuff done. We're going to get even more done in the future with your help. Thank you so much for watching us. We'll see you next time here on 10th or Tuesday. I gave the peace sign too, Mike.
All right.
All right. We'll see you guys. Thanks for watching.